As the war continued, harsh political realities and Lincoln's sense of the public's mood help explain why he delayed action on freeing the slaves. Many Northerners supported a war for the Union, not for emancipation. Most whites saw blacks as inferior and feared that emancipation would lure former slaves north to steal white jobs and demand political rights. If the president moved too fast on emancipation, he believed, he risked losing the allegiance of Northern racists, of offending the border states, and increasing the Democrats' chance for political victory. But if Lincoln did not move at all, he would alienate abolitionists and lose the support of radical Republicans, which he could also ill afford. In summer 1862, Lincoln told his cabinet he intended to emancipate the slaves. He was advised to delay until the North won a decisive military victory, and Lincoln took the advice. To counteract white fears of free blacks, he promoted ideas for establishing black colonies in Haiti and Panama. Lincoln linked emancipation to military necessity. And if Lincoln attacked slavery, it would be only because emancipation would save white lives, preserve democracy, and restore the Union. The Union victory at Antietam gave him the opportunity. On New Year's Day, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Yet the proclamation itself had no immediate impact on slavery. It didn't really free very many slaves. It only affected slaves living in unconquered parts of the Confederacy, and said nothing about slaves living in the border states or in those parts of the South which had been conquered. This is where the Emancipation Proclamation is good for, but not in these areas. Yet the Emancipation Proclamation had a tremendous symbolic importance. The proclamation transformed the nature of the war. For the first time, the government had committed itself to freeing slaves. What began as a war to save the Union became a struggle that, if victorious, would free the slaves. More immediately, the proclamation sanctioned the policy of accepting blacks into the military. It was also hoped that the news would reach Southern slaves, encouraging them to flee to Union lines or sabotage the Southern war effort. Also, important segments of the European public who opposed slavery now came to regard any attempt to help the South as immoral. The governments of Europe did not start to support the North, but foreigners could better understand and sympathize with a war to free the slaves more than they could with a war to save the Union. Now, blacks had offered themselves as soldiers from the very beginning in 1861, but they had been rejected. They were serving as cooks, workers, teamsters, carpenters in the army. However, right? Not combat. Positions. Yeah? Indeed, blacks made up as much as a quarter of the Navy. As white casualties mounted, however, so did pressure for black service on the battlefield. By war's end, 186,000 blacks, or 10% of the Army, had served the Union cause. Over 134,000 of them fugitives from slave states. But black soldiers, usually led by white officers, were second-class soldiers for most of the war, receiving lower pay, worse food, more menial work, and fewer benefits than the whites. If you've ever seen a movie made in the 80s or the 90s or something called Glory, and that's what this right here is, right? The very first black regiment going off into battle with a white officer, a white abolitionist officer. And they were all slaughtered. They were just all led into a slaughter, and they were all killed, including the white officer. The Army's racial experiment had mixed results, but the faithful and courageous service of black troops helped modify some of the racism in the North. And the black soldiers who conquered the South, many of them former slaves, felt pride and dignity in their accomplishments. We're into a couple years of this war now, and it's bogged down into a stalemate. As the conflict continued, casualties mounted, no end in sight. Basic assumptions about how the war should be waged weakened. One wartime casualty was the idea that war only involved armies. Early in the war, many officers tried to protect civilians and their property, but such concern for rebel property soon vanished. Southern troops, on the few occasions when they came north, acted the same. As the war dragged on, civilians were dragged in. In the early years of the war, Southern strategy combined defense with selected maneuvers. And until the summer of 1863, the strategy seemed to be working, at least in Virginia. Right? We're defending our home. We can buckle down. And eventually the North will give up and go home. But an occasional victory over the invading Northern Army would not change the course of the war. And while the idea that the North might give up and go home was shared by many, there was also the fear that eventually Northern economic, industrial, and population superiority would kick in. Without victories in the North, Lee believed, the South would not prevail. In the summer of 1863, he marched into Maryland and southern Pennsylvania. His goal was a victory that would threaten Philadelphia and Washington. He even dreamed of conquering a northern city. Such feats might force the North to sue for peace. On a hot and humid July in Gettysburg, Lee confronted a Union army led by General George Meade. During 3 days of fighting, the fatal obsession with outdated infantry charges returned, as Lee ordered costly assaults but probably lost him the battle. On July 3rd, Lee sent about 15,000 men against the Union center. The assault, known as Pickett's Charge, was futile. At 700 yards, the Union artillery opened fire. Gettysburg was a massive defeat. But neither Lee nor his men nor Southern civilians regarded it as conclusive, even though it really was. Fighting would continue for another year and a half, and while many remained hopeful, Lee's Gettysburg losses were so heavy that he could never mount another Southern offensive. Then Lincoln showed up and gave Gettysburg his address. So read that. Immediately after Gettysburg came the news of a great victory by Grant on July 4th at Vicksburg on the Mississippi. The capture of the city completed the Union campaign to gain control of the Mississippi River and divide the South. Grant demonstrated to Lincoln the boldness and flexibility that he had been looking for in a commander. The Union now controlled Tennessee, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, right? This whole chunk of land here. In March 1864, Lincoln appointed Grant General-in-Chief of all Union armies. Grant planned for victory within a year. As an outsider to the military establishment, Grant had no difficulty rejecting conventional military tactics. Grant had went to West Point, just like Lee and everybody else. But he graduated at the bottom of his class, as the worst student in his graduating class. And when he left West Point, he didn't actually join the military. He went back home to Ohio and worked in a store. Okay? But the war happens, we're raising up this army, and people rise up really fast. Wartime commissions, people proven through fire, and that's Grant. Right? He was able to be victorious on the Mississippi. Lincoln brought him over. And he sought a grim campaign of annihilation, of total war on both military and civilian populations, using the North's superior resources that are finally going to kick in to grind down the South. Although Grant's plan entailed large casualties on both sides, he justified it by arguing that the carnage would only last for 1 year. A campaign of annihilation involved the destruction not only of enemy armies, but of enemy resources. This total warfare was a relatively new and shocking idea. Grant, however, wanted to consume everything that could be used to support or supply armies and psychologically terrorize the Southern population to break their will to fight. Following this policy, Grant started after Lee in Virginia. Meanwhile, back in the West, he left Sherman in charge, right? To come down through Tennessee, get to Atlanta, and then follow the trains and up. Grant comes down this way, right? And as Sherman marches, he destroys everything. War, Sherman believed, must be waged on the minds of civilians to make the Southerners fear and dread their foes. Therefore, his campaign to seize Atlanta and his march to Savannah spread destruction and terror. I mean, that's what he did to Charleston. His troops were ordered to forage off the land, and his army left complete desolation in its wake. But this destruction, with its goal of total victory, threatened Lincoln's hope for reconciliation and reunion. Right? Nevertheless, winning the war was the priority. In 1864, Lincoln had to run for re-election. And in the North, his opponents accused him of being a dictator. Although he rarely tried to control Congress, veto legislation, or direct governmental appointments, Lincoln freely exercised executive power. He violated the Bill of Rights by locking up more than 13,000 Northerners without trial. He curbed press freedom by suppressing, disloyal newspapers that he considered disloyal. He established the draft. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation. He fired generals like it was nothing. Lincoln argued, however, that this vast extension of presidential power was temporarily justified because, as president, he was responsible for defending the nation and preserving the Constitution. It's the whole freedom and liberty versus security, right? And what are you willing to give up for the other? Well, in the Civil War, this was a war that's on your doorstep. So maybe you give up a little bit more of that freedom. Anyway. For the presidential election of 1864 in the North, the Democrats nominated General George McClellan, if you remember him. And capitalizing on weariness about the war, branded the war a failure and demanded a ceasefire. Democrats accused Lincoln of arbitrarily expanding executive power, arguing that the president had transformed the war from one for union into one for emancipation. They insinuated that a Republican victory would mean race mixing. Of course, this is a pro-Lincoln cartoon here. All right, the shame, the shame, the shame. Here's the South. Yay. Although Lincoln easily gained the Republican nomination, his party did not unite behind him. Not radical enough for some, and too radical to others, Lincoln seemed to please no one. However, Sherman's capture of Atlanta in September of 1864 and his march to Savannah helped swing voters to Lincoln. Victories showed the war was drawing to a close, and in the end, Republicans had no desire to see the Democrats in charge. Lincoln won 55% of the popular vote and swept the Electoral College. In the months after Lincoln's re-election, the war drew to an agonizing conclusion. Sherman moved north from Georgia to North Carolina, while Grant pummeled Lee in Virginia. Grant's losses were staggering, but new recruits replaced the dead. On April 9, 1865, Grant accepted Lee's surrender at Appomattox. Southern soldiers and officers were allowed to go home with their personal equipment after promising to remain there peacefully. The war, for all intents and purposes, was over. There were still some battles going on, but the war was over. Grant's military strategy succeeded because the Union's manpower and economic resources could survive the staggering losses of men and equipment, while the Confederacy could not. Despite impressive Southern growth in manufacturing and food production, Southern troops and Southern people were poorly fed and poorly clothed. New industries could not meet the extraordinary demands of wartime, and advancing Union forces destroyed much of what they had built. Women working alone or with disgruntled slaves could not produce enough food. Worn-out farm equipment was not replaced. Impressment of slaves into service led to the flight to Union lines of 500,000 blacks, further hurting production. The South's inadequate transportation system also contributed to the defeat. Primitive roads deteriorated and became impassable without repairs. The railroad system was minimal and insufficient. When tracks were worn out or destroyed, they couldn't be replaced. Food intended for the army rotted away in shipment, while soldiers went hungry and cities had food riots. The belief in states' rights and the sanctity of private property that gave birth to the Confederacy helped kill it. Conscription and taxes bred resentment and even open rebellion. Many Southern governors refused to contribute men, money, and supplies when requested by Jefferson Davis. When Sherman approached Atlanta, Georgia's governor would not turn over 10,000 men that were in the state militia to Confederate commanders. Slaveholders resisted the impressment of their slaves for war work. It was their private property that the government can't take away. In the end, the Confederacy collapsed, exhausted and dead. Hungry soldiers got letters revealing desperate situations at home. By December 1864, the Confederate desertion rate exceeded 50%. Replacements could not be found. About 3 million American men, 1/3 of all free males between the ages of 15 and 59, served in the military during the war. 1/3. Of all American wars, none has been more deadly. More than 5 times as many people killed than during World War II. About 360,000 Union soldiers and another 258 Southern soldiers died. About 1/3 of those because their wounds were either improperly treated or not treated at all. Disease claimed more lives than combat. Look at this. Almost 2% of the population is going to be killed in this war. 2% of the population. Disease, right? About 275,000 on each side were maimed. Another 410,000 combined served time in overcrowded and unsanitary prison camps. The worst memory was Andersonville in Georgia, where 31,000 Union soldiers were confined. At the war's end, over 12,000 graves were counted there. The war completely devastated the South. Southern wealth declined 43% during the war, regardless of slaves. Great cities like Atlanta, Columbia, Savannah, Richmond lay in ruins. Fields were burned or uncultivated. 1/3 or more of the South's livestock were gone. 2/3 of railroads had been destroyed. Thousands were hungry, homeless, and bitter about their 4 years of useless sacrifice. And on top of that, more than 3 million slaves were now free. But the war settled the Union and ended the states and federal government debate. No one's tried to secede since then, yes? The war also resolved the issue of slavery. Yet, with the end of the war, uncertainties outnumbered certainties. And then Lincoln was killed.